Hello, everybody. Today I want to talk to you about freshwater ecosystems. This is section 1 from chapter 7. Chapter 7 is aquatic ecosystems. Aquatic ecosystems just means, aquatic means water. So aquatic ecosystems would be all the ecosystems in the water. Last chapter we talked about biomes, and biomes are land ecosystems. Now we're talking about all the water ecosystems in this chapter. So let's start with the freshwater. And then next time we'll talk about marine ecosystems, which are the saltwater ones. So let's talk about the freshwater ones. At the end of this lesson, you should be able to describe the factors that determine where an organism lives in an aquatic ecosystem. So what factors determine whether they live near the surface or farther down or near the edge of the pond or in a river. Describe the littoral zone or the littoral zone, and describe the benthic zone, these zones that make up a lake or pond. Describe 2 environmental functions of wetlands. So wetlands are good for the environment because they do this and because they do that. Describe 1 threat against river ecosystems. Let's begin. The types of organisms in an aquatic ecosystem are mainly determined by the water's salinity. Salinity means how much salt is in the water. As a result, aquatic ecosystems can be divided into 2 categories: freshwater and marine, which means saltwater. Freshwater ecosystems would be ponds, lakes, streams, rivers, and wetlands. A wetland is an area of land that is periodically underwater, whose soil contains a great deal of moisture. They're very wet places to be. You would not want to wear your best sneakers to go into a wetland. So what is the characteristic of an aquatic ecosystem? There are factors such as temperature, sunlight, and oxygen and nutrients, and these will determine what organisms live in an area. So 5 things: temperature, sunlight, oxygen, and nutrients. Sorry, that's not 5 things, that's 4 things. Temperature, sunlight, oxygen, nutrients. Aquatic ecosystems contain several types of organisms that are grouped by their location and by their adaptations. 3 groups of aquatic organisms, things that live in the water, include planktons, nectons, and benthos. I think in the next slide, it's going to tell you what a plankton is and what a necton is and what a bentho is. These are the 3 different categories. Plankton are organisms that float in the water, and they just float. They don't swim around on their own power. A necton is one that does swim around. It swims around wherever it wants to in the pond. And a bentho is a bottom feeder, something that lives at the bottom. Plankton are the mass of mostly microscopic organisms that float or drift freely in the water. They're microscopic animals or plants. So a microscopic animal would be called a zooplankton. A microscopic plant or an algae is actually a diatom, these would be called phytoplanktons. The phytoplanktons do photosynthesis. The zooplanktons are animals, and you find animals at the zoo. So zooplankton, animals. Phyto, photosynthesis, phytoplankton, plants, okay? Necton are animals that swim actively in open water, independent of whatever currents are happening. So they won't be just pushed along by the currents. They're going to be able to swim around and choose where they go. Bentho, these are bottom-dwelling organisms of the sea or ocean. They're often attached to hard surfaces. So Barnacles, for example, or sea cucumbers would be benthos. There are also decomposers, and there are also decomposing aquatic organisms. So little pieces of bacteria or fungi. Lakes, ponds, and wetlands can form naturally where groundwater reaches Earth's surface. So under the ground, everywhere under the ground, there is a layer of water, kind of like in a wet sponge. So a wet sponge has water in it, but where is it? Well, it's in between, in all the little holes. And every bit of the ground, all the dirt, has little tiny holes in it. In some places, the holes are bigger, like where there's sandy soil. Around here, the soil is more like clay. So it's there's less little holes in them. But the water, there is actually water in between all of these little holes, in between all of the grains of dirt. So that's all called groundwater. And groundwater can sometimes reach the surface. And in those areas where the groundwater reaches the surface, where the groundwater is, it's called the water table. And if the water table is high, it can be near the surface. And any areas where the ground dips below the water table would make a lake or a pond or a wetland. Humans intentionally create artificial lakes. They can do this by damming up the flow of a river and or a stream. Then they can use these dams for power and they can use the artificial lakes that they make for irrigation or for water storage. That's called a reservoir. Or they can use them for recreation. Around here, there's a lake called Lake Wallenpaupack. Lake Wallenpaupack was a man-made lake. They built this dam, and they let water go over it, and there's a hydroelectric power station there. They make electricity by making water go over the dam and turning a turbine. They can make electricity. They also use Lake Wallenpaupack for recreation. And when I was a kid, my dad would take a boat out onto Lake Wallenpaupack. And if you ever got a mouthful of water from Lake Wallenpaupack, it tastes like oil. It tastes like gas, like diesel fuel or whatever they use in boats. It's really kind of nasty. But that's a lake that's used for recreation. And in the summer, you can see it's stuffed with boats. Lakes and ponds can be structured into horizontal and vertical zones. That means you can divide a lake and pond into areas that are near the shore or areas that are inland, and that's horizontal zones, okay? Close to the shore, farther out from shore. That's horizontal zones. They can also be structured vertical, so near the surface, and then farther from the surface, and then at the bottom would be another zone. The types of organisms that you find in these areas will depend on the amount of sunlight that is available. So let's talk about the zones of a lake. The littoral zone is the shallow zone of the fresh water where light reaches the bottom and nurtures the plants. Life here is diverse and abundant. There's lots of sun here. So this is areas where this would be like the edge of a lake or a pond, okay, close to the shore, where it's really shallow and the sunlight can get all the way to the bottom. So you're going to see grasses. Some plants have rooted in the mud underwater with their upper leaves and stems above the water. And other plants have floating leaves, like lily pads, for example. In open water, plants and algae and some bacteria can capture solar energy to make their own food. So these would be algae that float on the surface of the pond or the lake, and they can do photosynthesis. So toward the edge of the pond, in the littoral zone, you have plants that grow up from the bottom up to the surface. And when you get farther in, the plants at the bottom can't really grow tall enough to get to the surface to get enough sunlight. So there it is algae and floating plants that would dominate. Some bodies of fresh water have areas so deep that there's very little light available for photosynthesis. So these would be like Lake Michigan or Lake Ontario. These are really, really big lakes, and you can't even see across them. They're so big. If you go to one of these lakes, it looks like you're at the ocean because you can't see to the other side of the lake. Bacteria live in the deep areas of fresh water. And the fish here have adapted to cooler, darker water, and they live in this area. Only those fish that have adaptations for cooler and darker water. Eventually, dead and decaying organisms can reach the bottom layer, which is called the benthic zone. And the benthic zone is the region near the bottom of a pond or lake or ocean, which is inhabited by the decomposers, insect larvae, or clams. And what these things do is they wait for dead things that die near the surface. Okay, maybe the planktons, and maybe those the zooplankton and the phytoplankton. They don't live very long, and then they die. And as they die, they float, they sink to the bottom eventually. Or maybe fish that die near the surface and eat those zooplankton. When they die, maybe some of them will sink. Well, they'll float for a while, but then they'll eventually get logged with water and sink down to the bottom. And when they get to the bottom, the clams will, and the insect larvae and the other bottom feeders will be waiting for them. Animals that live in lakes and ponds have adaptations to help them obtain what they need to survive. Just like everywhere, animals have adaptations to help them survive. For example, in an aquatic, in a lake, water beetles will use their little hairs under their bodies to trap surface air that they can use to breathe when they dive down for food. It's very cool. And in regions where lakes partially freeze in the winter, like around here, the amphibians, the frogs and the salamanders, burrow partway into the mud where it's not going to freeze in order to hibernate. Now let's talk about how nutrients affect lakes. So there is a thing that can happen where too many nutrients come into a lake or pond. This is called eutrophication. I know it starts with an E, but that E and the U together make a U sound. Eutrophication is an increase in the amount of nutrients, such as nitrates, in the aquatic ecosystem. So nitrates, where do we find those? In farms. It's good for the soil. Nitrogen, the legumes can pull nitrogen out of the atmosphere and into the soil. Or when a farmer spreads manure on either natural nitrates like manure on their field, or synthetic nitrates like fertilizer that's made, like mass-produced fertilizer. These nitrates, if too many of them get into a lake, they cause eutrophication. And eutrophication is actually an overgrowth. So, plants love nitrogen. So as nitrogen gets in, so too much nitrogen gets into the lake, the plants will start to grow like crazy, the plants and algae. And that's great for them, but it upsets the balance. The number of bacteria feeding on the decaying organisms, like these plants and algae, also grows because more plants on the surface of the pond, and then suddenly the pond is all green. You don't see any water anymore. You're just all algae floating on the surface of the pond. But algae doesn't live very long, and it sinks to the bottom, and then these bacteria will eat them, and they love it. It tastes, it's just lots and lots of food for them. But these bacteria use oxygen dissolved in the water. So if there's a lot of them, eventually they will reduce the total amount of oxygen in the water. And there are other organisms that need that oxygen, like fish. Fish need oxygen dissolved in the water in order to breathe through their gills. A lake that has large amounts of plant growth due to the nutrients is called a eutrophic lake. Lakes naturally become eutrophic over a long period of time. However, eutrophication can be accelerated by runoff, such as rain, And these the rain can carry with it sewage or fertilizers or animal waste from the land into the water. So that was pollution for lakes. Now we're going to talk about something else: freshwater wetlands. Freshwater wetlands are areas of land that are covered with fresh water for part of the year. The two main types of freshwater wetlands are marshes and swamps. So how are they different? Marshes contain non-woody plants like grasses, while swamps are dominated by woody plants, trees. Most freshwater wetlands are located in the southeastern United States. The largest freshwater wetland is the Florida Everglades. This green shows you where all the biggest wetlands in the whole country are. There are some wetlands up in upper Michigan and in northern Minnesota, and then all throughout Texas, Louisiana. In Louisiana, it's called the Bayou. Mississippi, Alabama, Georgia, and Florida, and all the way up in South Carolina, North Carolina. Okay, these are the swamps and the marshes of the eastern coast. Okay, and then this one down here, the big one at the bottom of Florida, is the Florida Everglades. Wetlands perform several important environmental functions. So let's talk about what those functions are. We're going to count them. 1, wetlands act like filters or sponges. They can absorb pollution from the water. 2, they can also control flooding by absorbing extra water. They act like a holding area, like a bowl where you can put the water that overflows from a river, so that it'll say, okay, I'll hold on to the water for a little bit, because what would happen if all that water went down the river, it would flood and break things, because water is really powerful. Water carved the Grand Canyon over millions of years, but that just shows how powerful water is. You can also see how powerful water is every spring. You just look around all the roads in the Valley of Scranton, in Northeast Pennsylvania. We have so many hills. What does the water do? It runs downhill. And as it does, it carries pieces of road with it, so that you get these huge potholes and you get washout in the roads. Water is very powerful. So these wetlands will act like a holding tank or a holding area, so that the water can slowly be let out, so it doesn't break things. 3, these areas also provide a home for native plants and migratory wildlife. 4, they also provide spawning areas for many freshwater fish. Okay, so let's talk about all of those again. Number 1, they act like filters. They'll scrub pollution out of the water. Number 2, they control flooding. They help to hold on to the water for a little while. Number 3, they provide a home for native and migratory wildlife like birds. And number 4, they provide feeding and spawning areas for lots of fish. Spawning means reproduction, baby fish, a place for them to lay their eggs where the current is not going to carry them away. So there's a lot of stationary water. And that's why wetlands don't smell so great, because the water is not going anywhere. But it's really good for fish and things that are alive, because they need a place to lay their eggs where the eggs are not going to wash away. All right, so here they are, the functions of a wetland. Why do they have so many more things than I counted? Well, let's see. Filtering, yes, that's the one we have. They reduce the likelihood of a flood because they store water. They buffer the shorelines against erosion. Okay, so those two are part of number 2. They hold on to the water. They provide spawning grounds and habitat for commercially imported fish and shellfish. Okay, that's a place for the ocean fish to come inland and make their babies and then go back out into the ocean. They provide habitat for rare and threatened and endangered species, and they provide recreational activities for people like fishing, bird watching, hiking, canoeing, photography, painting, because they're so beautiful. Okay, let's talk about marshes. Freshwater marshes tend to occur on low, flat lands and have little water movement. In shallow waters, plants root themselves to the rich bottom sediments, while their leaves stick out above the surface of the water all year round. There are lots of kinds of marshes. Each of them have a different salinity. Remember that salinity is the amount of salt in the water. Okay, brackish is a word that means a little bit salty. So brackish marshes have slightly salty water, while salt marshes contain much saltier water, almost like ocean water. The benthic zones of marshes are very nutrient rich. They contain plants and numerous types of decomposers and scavengers. Waterfowl, so fowl means birds. Waterfowl like ducks that have flat beaks adapted for sifting through the water for fish and insects. Other water birds like herons have spear-like beaks that they use to grab or grasp or stab small fish. And they can probe for frogs also in the mud. Marshes also attract migratory birds from temperate and tropical habitats. All right, swamps. Swamps occur on flat, poorly drained land, often near streams, and they're dominated by woody shrubs or water-loving trees. Freshwater swamps are an ideal habitat for lots of amphibians because of the continuous moisture. Birds also love the hollow trees that are near or over the water because the water is their source of food, right? All the fish that are in the water, or the insects that live near the water. Because lots of insects need water in order to breed. Mosquitoes, for example, they need a body of water. I mean, as small as a bucket of water. If you leave a bucket of water out in the summer, you're going to find a whole bunch of mosquitoes, eggs and making babies in that water. So reptiles are the predators of the swamp. Okay, so reptiles are the predators of the swamp. Snapping turtles, alligators, eating most any organism that crosses their path. Good. Human impacts on wetlands. So wetlands were previously considered to be wastes. What are these wetlands good for? Because you go out into the wetland and you'd say, I can't stand on this land. I'm sinking down into the mud. What good is this? They also said, well, this is a breeding ground for insects, for mosquitoes that carry diseases like malaria. So these wetlands have to go. That's what people used to think. And as a result, lots of wetlands were drained or filled in or cleared for farms or residential and commercial development. Washington, D.C. was a swamp or a marsh before it was a city. It was filled in. Lots of land, lots of dirt was brought in, and lots of rocks were brought in order to make Washington, D.C. what it is today. Okay, so that's a great example of how humans filled in the wetlands because they thought that they were no good. But now we recognize the importance of wetlands for those reasons that we said before, as a filter, as a buffer for the water, so that it doesn't hurt, so it doesn't break things, for the animals that can live there, that migrate to, or they use it for their breeding grounds. Many states now prohibit the destruction of certain wetlands. For example, if you wanted to build a house and you found out that the land that you built has a wetland on it, you would not be able to build your house on that land that was designated a wetland. So you have to be careful. Wetlands are protected and they're very important for our environment. So they can't just be built over. Okay, so now we're going to talk about rivers. At their headwaters, That means where they begin. A river is usually very cold, full of oxygen, and runs swiftly through and not very deep riverbed, a shallow riverbed. So these would be up in the mountains, and up in the mountains, it's more steep. And where the ground is very steep, the water runs downhill faster. It does. Steepness means go faster. And, you know, like anyone who has ever gone sledding knows that when you get to the steep part, your sled goes faster. So yeah, rivers, when they start up in the mountains, they are running faster because it's steeper there. Now, as the river flows down the mountain, gets to level ground, it is going to broaden, like get bigger, because more rivers are going to join up with that flow. They'll become warmer, they'll become wider, they'll become slower. Why slower? Because now the ground is almost level that they're going on, because they're not up in the mountains anymore. And there's less oxygen. Why? Because some of it has come out, because some of the fish have used it, the organisms have used it, or it has just, you know, gone out of the water. A river changes with the land and the climate through which it flows. So if it flows through an area where there's a different climate, it's going to take on characteristics of that climate. So what do you find in a river? In and near the headwaters of a river, so up in the mountains where the river begins, you find mosses that anchor themselves to the rock through root-like structures called rhizoids. And trout and minnows have adapted to these cold, oxygen-rich waters. Farther downstream, plankton can float on the warm, calm water. So plants here can set down roots and live in the rich sediment of the river. And the plant's leaves can vary in shape according to the strength of the river currents. Where there's a strong river current, the leaves can't be very big, or else the whole plant is going to get pulled out by the river's current. If the river is not flowing very fast, then the leaves of the plants can be bigger. So let's move on. Fish such as catfish and carp also live in these calmer waters. But rivers are in danger. So let's talk about some of the threats to the river ecosystem. Industries, so factories, they love to use river water in the manufacturing process as receptacles for waste, but also for cooling. So if you have a power plant near the water, it needs to be able to regulate its temperature. So oftentimes what will happen is there will be a place where the water can come into the power plant. And then as the water flows out of that power plant, it's usually warmer. So they use the river to cool their factory because it's always new, cool water that's coming by. But what that's going to do is downstream raise the average temperature of the water, and that's not good. That can be very bad for the fish downstream or for the plants that live downstream. Also, dumping waste in a river is not very good because it's going to cause problems like, for example, if it's nitrogen or phosphorus, it's going to cause that eutrophication, right? Too many nutrients in the water, which is going to cause rapid growth of things and make unbalance so that other organisms will not be able to have enough oxygen. In addition, people have used rivers to dispose of their sewage and their garbage, and that's not good. These practices have polluted rivers with toxins in the past, which have caused river organisms, which have killed river organisms and made river fish inedible. That means you can't eat them because they're no good. So, you know, we can't be dumping our stuff in the river. It's no good. Today, runoff from the land can put pesticides and other poisons into the river. They can coat the riverbeds with toxic sediments. They can also cause that eutrophication that we talked about. All right, thank you guys very much.